Today, we're going over the most extreme cases of vigilante justice in history. People who took the law into their own hands when the system failed them. The widow who hunted down her husband's killers. It's 1888, and a woman named Lora Edwards is standing over the fresh grave of her husband in a small Texas town. Her hands are trembling. Her eyes are swollen. She'd just buried the only man she'd ever loved. 3 weeks earlier, Frank Edwards had been gunned down in broad daylight by 3 hired assassins. The men had been sent by a rival cattle baron named Joseph Sparks, a ruthless land grabber who had been trying to buy up their ranch for years. When Frank refused to sell, Sparks took matters into his own hands. The killers were known men: James Dent, William Webb, and Charles Thompson. They'd been spotted leaving the scene, their horses covered in dust and their guns still smoking. Witnesses identified them without hesitation, but there was a problem. The local sheriff was in Sparks' pocket. Every bit of evidence gathered against the killers mysteriously disappeared. Witnesses were threatened. The judge removed himself from the case under suspicious circumstances. And within a month, the case was quietly closed. Sparks had won. The law had failed. Lora Edwards was 38 years old, a mother of 3, and had never fired a gun in her life. But she had one thing the killers didn't expect. She had nothing left to lose. She sold the ranch, took the money, and bought a Winchester repeating rifle, the gun that won the West. She told her children she'd be back soon. Then she vanished into the wilderness. For the next 6 months, Lora became a ghost. She tracked the 3 killers across 3 states, living off the land, sleeping under the stars, and learning to shoot until her hands were calloused and her aim was deadly. She found James Dent first in a saloon in New Mexico territory. He was leaning against the bar, laughing and bragging about the Edwards job to anyone who'd listen. Lora walked in, walked up behind him, and pressed the barrel of her Winchester into the back of his head. The saloon went silent. Lora didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Dent knew who she was. He begged for his life. He offered money. He offered anything. But Lora Edwards didn't come for money. She pulled the trigger. The bullet blew Dent's head clean off and lodged into a whiskey barrel behind the bar. Lora walked out. The patrons of the saloon were too stunned to move. She found William Webb next in a tent camp outside Dodge City. Webb was a nasty piece of work who had moved on to armed robbery after the Edwards job. He was sitting around a campfire with his new gang when a woman's silhouette appeared on the ridge above them. "Which one of you is Webb?" she shouted. The men scrambled for their guns, but Lora was faster. She fired 3 rounds from the ridge and dropped 2 of them instantly. Webb dove behind a wagon, but Lora had already circled around. She walked up to the wagon, leaned over, and put a bullet between his eyes. The 3rd killer, Charles Thompson, was smart. He'd heard about the first 2. He went underground, changing his name and moving to a remote mountain cabin in Colorado. He thought he was safe. He was wrong. Lora tracked him for another 2 months. When she finally found his cabin, she didn't storm in guns blazing. Instead, she waited. She watched. She learned his routine. And one night, when Thompson stepped outside to chop wood, she stepped out of the shadows. Thompson dropped his axe. He tried to run, but Lora had already closed the distance. She shoved her rifle into his back, marched him into the mountains, and made him dig his own grave. She didn't say a word the entire time. When the grave was finished, she made him kneel. Then she shot him once in the back of the head and pushed his body into the hole he'd just dug. Lora Edwards returned to her children 3 weeks later. She never spoke about the men she'd killed, but when the bodies of the 3 assassins were discovered over the following months, the newspapers ran headlines calling her the Avenging Widow. And Joseph Sparks? He got what was coming too. He went bankrupt within a year after his cattle empire fell apart. He died penniless and alone in a boarding house. His name was a curse word in every county in Texas. Lora lived to be 82. She was buried next to her husband Frank. The grave marker above them reads simply, "Together at last." The factory worker who assassinated the president. It's December 23, 1900, and a 24-year-old former factory worker named Leon Czolgosz is standing in a crowd at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. He's wearing a brand new suit he bought specifically for this day. His right hand is wrapped in a clean white handkerchief. But he's not there to admire the exhibits. He's there to kill the President of the United States. William McKinley, the 25th President of the United States, had been in office since 1897, and in that time, the country had grown rich off the backs of workers like Leon. But while McKinley sipped champagne with his Wall Street buddies, families in places like Leon's hometown were starving. The gap between the rich and the poor had become a canyon. Leon had spent years listening to the words of anarchist speakers, men who preached that the system was rigged, that the rich exploited the poor, and that violence was the only language the powerful understood. He started reading, he started thinking, and eventually he started planning. McKinley had come to the exposition to promote American industry and international trade. He had no idea that a sickly factory worker had been following his movements for weeks. Leon had tried to get close to the president before, but the security was tight. But today was special. McKinley was greeting the public in the Temple of Music, shaking hands with anyone who approached. Leon stepped into the line. As he got closer, he could see the Secret Service agents scanning the crowd, their eyes darting nervously. But they were looking for angry men with guns, not a quiet young man in a new suit with a handkerchief over his hand. Leon reached the front of the line. McKinley smiled. "Good morning," the president said, extending his hand. Leon smiled back, and as he reached for the president's hand, he pushed his right fist forward. Bang! The first shot glanced off McKinley's ribs, but Leon had trained for this. He was already pulling the trigger again. Bang! The second bullet hit the president square in the abdomen, tearing through his stomach, pancreas, and kidney. The crowd erupted in screams. Secret Service agents swarmed Leon, tackling him to the ground and beating him with their fists and the butts of their guns. But it was too late. The damage was done. McKinley was rushed to a nearby hospital, but the medical care in 1900 was primitive at best. Doctors used a light bulb rigged to a mirror to reflect light into his wound because the hospital didn't have electricity. They stitched him up, but the bullet had done its job. 8 days later, William McKinley died. He was the third American president to be assassinated in 35 years. Leon Czolgosz was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death. But here's the thing. Even after he was convicted, Leon showed no remorse. In fact, he was proud of what he'd done. "I killed the president because he was the enemy of the good people, the working people," he told the court. "I did my duty." Now, you might be thinking, this isn't vigilante justice, this is just murder. But here's where it gets complicated. In the aftermath of McKinley's death, a spotlight was shown on the conditions of American factory workers in a way it had never been before. Newspapers' exposés about child labor, 16-hour workdays, and wages so low they'd make you sick. Public outrage was massive. The government couldn't ignore it. Pressure mounted, and within a decade, the first major labor reforms began to pass. Minimum wage laws, child labor restrictions, safety standards. Leon Czolgosz became a symbol, though not the one he intended. He didn't inspire an anarchist revolution, but his act of violence forced the powerful to finally pay attention to the suffering of the poor. Was what he did right? No. Was it just? Maybe, but in the end, the ultimate justice came not from his bullets, but from the public outrage that followed. He was executed by electric chair on October 29, 1901. His final words? "I killed the president because he was a parasite on the American people." Leon Czolgosz was buried in an unmarked grave at the prison cemetery. His body was doused with sulfuric acid to ensure nobody would ever try to dig him up and make him a martyr. But his message lived on. The system had been failing people for decades, and one desperate man finally said enough. It cost him his life, but it forced the rest of America to finally look in the mirror. Some call him a murderer, others call him a hero, most just call him a warning. But one thing's for sure, the law failed the factory workers of America. So Leon Czolgosz took the law into his own hands, and the entire country was never the same. The duel that destroyed a political dynasty. It's 1804, and Aaron Burr is standing on a rocky ledge in Weehawken, New Jersey, staring down the barrel of a dueling pistol. His heartbeat is deafening in his ears. Across from him, just 10 paces away, stands the most famous man in America, Alexander Hamilton. The two had been bitter political rivals for years, but this wasn't about politics anymore. This was personal. See, Burr had spent his entire life chasing greatness. He'd fought in the Revolution, become a senator, and nearly won the presidency in 1800. But every time he climbed the ladder, Hamilton was there to kick it out from under him. The bastard had sabotaged his political career at every turn, spreading rumors, writing pamphlets, whispering in the right ears. And then came the 1804 New York governor's race. Burr ran for governor and lost. But it wasn't the loss that broke him. It was what Hamilton did during the campaign. The man had allegedly called Burr despicable and implied he was a traitor. When the comments were printed in a newspaper, Burr demanded an explanation. Hamilton's response? Evasive nonsense. So Burr did what any man of honor would do in 1804. He challenged Hamilton to a duel. Now, here's where it gets juicy. Hamilton was actually a decent shot, but he'd already told multiple people he intended to throw his first shot, to fire into the air and end the duel without bloodshed. In his mind, this would satisfy his honor without killing a man he didn't actually hate. But Burr didn't know that. The signal is given. Both men raise their pistols. Hamilton takes aim and fires into the air above Burr's head. He'd kept his promise. But Burr saw the smoke and heard the bullet whiz past, and in that split second, he thought Hamilton had just tried to kill him. So Aaron Burr pulled the trigger and shot Alexander Hamilton square in the chest. The bullet lodged near Hamilton's spine, shattering ribs and puncturing his lung. He collapsed, bleeding out in front of his friends. Burr, in shock, fled the scene and went into hiding. Hamilton died the next day. His final words, "This is a mortal wound, doctor." And then, in true Hamilton fashion, he asked the doctor to give him last rites while he prepared to meet his maker. But here's the real kicker. While Burr survived the duel, his reputation was destroyed. Murder charges were filed, and though he was never convicted, the court of public opinion had already sentenced him. He fled New York and eventually headed west, where he got wrapped up in some bizarre conspiracy to create his own empire in Mexico. He was arrested for treason, acquitted, and spent his final years as a lawyer in obscurity. A man who could have been president died as a forgotten nobody, hated by the nation he'd helped build, all because he couldn't let a grudge go. Oh, and the duel? It became a national scandal. Churches condemned dueling from the pulpit. The practice became so hated that it was outlawed in most states within a few decades. Alexander Hamilton got the last laugh, even in death.